And just to clarify for people who are entering the room, we're recording the presentation piece of this presentation this morning. We will stop the recording at the end of the presentation, so questions will not be recorded. This is just for posterity and being able to share the contents of our presentation for the future. So with that, we will go ahead and get started with the content. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today to hear about the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, or RMA for short. We understand there may be different levels of knowledge about the RMA. Hopefully this meeting will provide a better understanding of it and how it will affect your communities. Please note that we are giving 6 of these presentations. This is the 5th. The content of each presentation is the same. So I'd like to introduce Justin Gost, our Natural Resources Specialist and presenter for today. Also on our team are Cheryl Grabham, our Program Manager of the Materials Management Product Stewardship Team, Roxanne Nair, our Recycling Program Analyst, and myself, Hannah Carlson. I'm a graduate student intern from Portland State University. I'd also like to introduce our regional specialists who are on the call. DEQ has 3 regions divided into the Eastern, Western, and Northwest regions. Some of the folks today are viewing this meeting in person today along with their regional specialists. So I'd like to welcome Lori, Gretchen, Kat, and Kathy. Next, we'll go to a few tips for using Zoom effectively. I'd like to please note that you should join the meeting by audio through either your phone or your computer, but not both. You may use the raise hand button on the bottom of your Zoom application to indicate if you have a question. If you're on the phone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand. We request that you please also say your name and organization when you speak. And then we also wanted to note that we'll have dedicated time after the presentation for questions and discussion. So we do ask that you please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. We also ask that you remain muted unless you're asking a question. This helps to reduce background noise and any distractions. And then if you're having any Zoom technical issues, you can send a message through the chat to me, Hannah Carlson, or you can email me at hannah.carlson@deq.oregon.gov, and we will work on that together to troubleshoot the problem. We'll also be using Zoom's poll feature, which means giving all the participants a chance to give input. You'll see a pop-up window appear in your Zoom application, and you may select an answer. So I'll run a brief poll. You should have a pop-up window appear on your screen, and it says, had you heard of the Recycling Modernization Act prior to receiving this meeting invitation? With the options to select yes, no, or I don't know. And this is just to gauge where people are at and practice using this tool. I'll give it a couple more seconds as people participate. And then now I will close it and share the results. We can see many people have heard of it, but several have not or are not sure. We hope to be able to bring everybody's understanding up to a stronger level. And thank you for participating in that little activity. So the next thing I'll present here is the agenda. The goal for today's meeting is to provide you with an overview of the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, with an emphasis on the opportunities and impacts on Oregon's local governments and service providers. First, we'll provide context on the state of recycling in Oregon. We will touch on the path to legislation and give an overview of the Recycling Modernization Act. We will cover how the law works, the opportunities for compensation for local governments, and we'll discuss the upcoming needs assessment regarding recycling services. Finally, we've designated time after the presentation for your questions. So now I will hand it over to Justin.
Perfect. Thank you, Hannah. And good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. So let's begin with where Oregon is now. For decades, most local governments have been providing households and businesses with the opportunity to recycle, with an arrangement between them and their service providers, who operate mostly under franchise agreements in their respective areas. Others do licenses. Service providers charge their customers a rate based on system expenses that are approved by the local government And this means that in Oregon, recycling costs are paid for by system users like any other utility bill. Now, recyclables have been collected, are sent to a materials recycling facility, also called a MRF, who is responsible for sorting and marketing that recyclable material. For some time, Oregon was relying on export markets to take its recyclables, and a large quantity was sent to China. That was until China implemented its national sword policy in 2018, which banned the importation of most plastics and some paper grades and set strict, some would say unachievable, contamination limits on other paper grades. Other Southeast Asian countries would also follow suit. The national sword policy fundamentally reshuffled global recycling markets, but it also offered the US an opportunity to finally address the problems that were plaguing its recycling system for some time. As with most states, national sword impacted Oregon economically as commodity values dropped and operational costs at MRFs increased. Many communities raised rates to maintain service, others dropped materials from their collection programs, and some communities did a combination of both. Now, Oregon was facing many challenges with its recycling system. These challenges included customer confusion about what can be recycled, knowing that materials list and what's accepted changes from community to community statewide. Worries that recycling markets will change, that recyclables will not be valued, and what is recyclable will change over time. There's concerns regarding plastic pollution and the fact that plastic pollution and waste is increasing. There's inequities associated with MRF workers' wellness and wages, as well as inequities in access to recycling by multifamily housing residents, as well as access to recycling for the rural residents of our state. There are also questions of accountability for overall reduction of plastic waste being created within the system. And lastly, there's concern from some that collected recycling is not actually being recycled or is not going to responsible end markets to be handled. To address these challenges, in 2018, DEQ convened the Recycling Steering Committee, which is made up of members that represented a cross-section of parties active in Oregon's recycling system. And there may be some members of the RSC on this call today. The RSC's goal was to examine the issues Oregon's system was facing and make recommendations that would modernize Oregon's recycling system, including optimizing the environmental benefits of managing materials at the end of life using the life cycle perspective, creating a recovery system that is strong and resilient to changes in supply and demand, also restoring and maintaining public trust in the system through education and engagement with the public. The committee also set out to consider the needs of different parts of the state to balance recycling solutions with broader product life cycle considerations and to find opportunities to better integrate with Oregon's 2050 vision for sustainable materials management. And in September 2020, the committee made a consensus recommendation that members felt would improve and stabilize Oregon's recycling programs, and DEQ drafted a legislative concept based on the committee's proposal. The bill, known as the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, as Hannah noted, but we will call it the RMA, on January 1st of this year. Now, the RMA uses an extended producer responsibility or EPR approach. EPR means assigning more responsibility to the producer over the lifetime of a product that they manufacture. The image you see on the screen shows the life cycle of a product, split roughly into 4 phases: extraction of natural resources, the production of the product, the consumption of a product, and the end-of-life management of the product. And knowing that the environmental benefit, or not benefits, but the environmental impacts of products mostly are found within the first 2 phases of this, the extraction and production portion. Traditionally, the responsibility for producers of products like single-use plastic utensils does not extend beyond the point of sale to consumers. Consumers are responsible for disposing of the product through methods available to them in their area, such as recycling and garbage collection. The idea of EPR is to extend producer responsibility beyond the point of sale, with a focus on managing or disposing of a material at the end of its life. The responsibilities in EPR can include many things, including financial, physical, or legal obligations to handle a product. Now, unlike other EPR systems globally, the RMA does not place responsibilities uniquely on the shoulders of producers. Under the Act's shared responsibility approach, the local collection infrastructure will remain intact, and ratepayers will continue to receive and pay for the services they already have. MRFs, for the most part, will continue to operate as they do today, though DEQ will establish new permit and certification requirements for those facilities. Under the RMA, local governments, service providers, and producers will all take on new responsibilities to address the problem of plastic pollution and the need to change and modernize our recycling system as the Act's name indicates. The passage of the Act requires DEQ to write administrative rules and has set us on a roughly 3+ year journey where we are undertaking a number of studies, consultations, and other processes as we prepare for the system to come online July 1st, 2025. Key startup components include 2 rulemaking periods that DEQ is conducting, the first of which is currently in progress. And that rulemaking process is addressing everything from materials lists to the PRO itself and responsibilities around that, as well as local government compensation. The second rulemaking period is scheduled to occur from mid to late summer 2023 through early 2024. And that rulemaking period will address life cycle assessments, generator facing contamination reduction, all things associated with the MRFs and others. And more information on participation in those rulemaking meetings will be shared near the end of this presentation. So now let's talk about how the RMA will work in action. The materials identified in the Act described as covered products include packaging, printed paper, and food serviceware. And some examples could be cereal boxes, plastic tubs, containers and clamshells, and newspapers. Producers of covered products will be required to join and pay a fee to a producer responsibility organization, or as refer to it as either a PRO or a PRO. PROs are nonprofit organizations that are responsible for administering a producer responsibility program on behalf of the producers covered under the Act. And any brand or manufacturer that meets the law's definition of producer will be required to participate in the system and register with a PRO. They will pay fees to the PRO on the covered products they sell or distribute into Oregon. In Oregon's shared producer responsibility system, the fees collected will be used to cover the financial obligations producers have to improving Oregon's recycling system. The second element is the uniform statewide collection list. This list will standardize what is recyclable across Oregon, regardless of location. The state is currently in the process of recommending materials for inclusion on the uniform statewide collection list, and those recommendations were heard last week by the agency's rulemaking advisory committee. And we will continue those conversations and that discussion around materials on our January 11th RAC meeting. The uniform list will help reduce confusion about what materials can be recycled statewide, and local governments required to provide service in accordance with the state's Opportunity to Recycle Act will be required to collect the materials on that list either en route, aka curbside, or at a recycling depot, or a combination of both. Third, the Act helps with expanding recycling services provided by local governments, whether that collection is en route curbside collection or at drop-off depots. The new law creates several improvements. Local governments interested in expanding collection services could benefit from producer funding that would cover startup costs such as trucks, containers, and necessary education and promotional materials associated with the rollout of that service. For new or expanded depots, producer funding would cover costs associated with containers, on-site monitoring equipment, site preparation, or other operational costs, including staffing. And we will talk more about how that will work in just a few minutes. Fourth, the PRO, in consultation with the state's recycling council, is required to develop new statewide education materials and campaigns, including container signs and decals. And those materials must educate residents and businesses on the uniform statewide collection list, how to properly prepare materials for recycling, and the importance of not placing contaminants in the commingled recycling collection stream. All educational resources and campaigns created by the Pro must be culturally responsive to diverse audiences across the state, including people who speak languages other than English and people with disabilities. They must be printed or produced in languages other than English, and the resources must be easily accessible and available at no cost to local governments and users of the recycling system. The pros must provide an opportunity for local government and service providers to review and comment on draft materials, and all educational materials must be developed in a manner that allows each local government or the local government service providers to customize the resources to reflect local conditions. And finally, as previously noted, DEQ will permit or certify commingled recycling processing facilities that sort recyclables, requiring them to meet new performance standards. I will note there's a permit and there's a certification program because DEQ can only permit in-state facilities. Any facility outside of the state of Oregon that is handling Oregon material would have to meet a certification, and the standards under the permit will be the same under the certification program. Now, these standards that will fall under the permit and certification programs will include an evaluation of inbound contamination, MRFs reporting on the final disposition of materials, amongst other things. And facilities outside of the state will need to meet these requirements as well, as I noted, through the certification program. The Pro will also pay processing facilities fees to manage contamination and mitigate the commodity risk through the contamination management fee and the processor commodity risk fee, two fees that will be addressed in the second rulemaking period. So let's look at the changes for cities at over 4,000. The Act creates new requirements for cities with over 4,000 people, cities in the Metro Regional Service District, and their associated urban growth boundaries. First, these jurisdictions will be required to collect curbside the materials on the uniform statewide collection list. They will ensure collected recyclables go to permitted commingled recycling processing facilities as well. Second, local governments and service providers will also implement strategies to reduce contamination at the residential and commercial customer level based off the statewide list of program elements compiled by DEQ. DEQ will provide this list to local governments and work with them to choose what is best for their community. Additionally, DEQ will establish state and local level recycling contamination reduction goals. Finally, local governments will also utilize new statewide educational resources and campaigns created by producers to promote the uniform collection list and contamination reduction. And all these requirements will go into effect July 1st, 2025. In 2026, there will be a few more required elements going into effect for cities over 4,000 in population. Beginning January 1st, local jurisdictions looking to purchase new roll carts, bins, and containers must ensure the containers being purchased are manufactured using at least 10% certified post-consumer recycled content resin. Then, by July of that year, cities and counties will make sure that multifamily properties have adequate collection service and that any new construction and significant remodels will have adequate space for containers. Let's look at changes for cities under 4,000. These items are required for all communities, including those under 4,000 in population. All disposal sites that are currently required under state law to offer recycling opportunities will need to collect source-separated recyclable materials and items on the uniform statewide collection list. Also, all local governments will be required to ensure that materials collected go to a permitted or certified processing facility. I will note that if a MRF is not permitted or does not have certification, they will not be able to accept materials collected from Oregon's recycling system. Now, the RMA also creates new voluntary opportunities for communities not currently required to offer recycling programs. PRO funding will be available to a local government service provider, or another person authorized by the local government to receive funding in order to improve or create recycling services. All communities, including cities under 4,000 in population, will be able to benefit from these programs and funding opportunities. And as mentioned, local jurisdictions may expand collection opportunities by making use of producer funding for startup costs, including new trucks, containers, and signage, as well as ongoing costs for new depots. DEQ will survey local governments through a needs assessment to determine their interest in expanding collection services. We'll talk more about the needs assessment in a few minutes. Also, communities transferring covered products greater than 50 miles from a recycling depot or recycling reload facility to a commingled MRF or a responsible end market will receive reimbursement of those transportation costs to the fullest extent possible. This means costs will no longer be disproportionately high for cities and counties to recycle just because they're located further away from processing facilities. In addition, cities under 4,000 may also choose to participate in the contamination reduction programming funded by producer fees. While required for cities with populations over 4,000 people, this is a voluntary option for cities with populations under 4,000. So now let's talk about some potential funding opportunities for local governments or their service providers. If a local government participates in the needs assessment survey and identifies services or areas of interest for expanding recycling programs, they will be eligible for PRO funding for the following, as noted. The eligible expenses for en route startup include new trucks, containers, educational materials, and costs associated with a recycling reload facility if it's determined that such a facility is in fact needed. Meanwhile, for depots, eligible startup and operational expenses may include containers, monitoring equipment, site preparation, and new staffing, amongst other things. And part of the new system will allow funding to be provided in advance or via the reimbursement approach. And this will be a decision that's made between the local government, their service provider, and the PRO. So here are a few examples of how this would work. During the needs assessment, for cities that do not currently have curbside recycling programs and would like to start up a curbside recycling program in their city, they could be eligible for the PROs to cover the costs of those new containers or the new collection truck or trucks that are needed for that service. Another example would be for cities that do not have a recycling depot or would like to expand on a current depot. They could identify this need during the assessment, and the PROs would cover the costs of new containers or other equipment to operate that depot properly. This could also cover the cost of new staffing to help operate at that depot. And in addition, as I noted, let's remember that communities that are further than 50 miles from the nearest commingled MRF or responsible end market would also be eligible for the transportation reimbursement. So in the RMA Shared Responsibility Program, the PRO will cover many costs within the system, and the local governments will continue to cover the costs of the collection part of the system. So for those who participate in the needs assessment, there are many financial benefits that can help local governments to expand recycling services. And to perform the needs assessment, the initial one, DEQ is contracted with Eunomia Research Consulting. And Eunomia, along with the help of our DEQ regional staff, will be surveying local governments and service providers statewide in anticipation of a July 1st, 2023 deadline, the date that we need to have the initial needs assessment completed. The details on how the needs assessment will work are in the planning stages right now, and Eunomia plans to host 2 informational meetings about the needs assessment survey in early 2023. And we would like you to know that completing the survey is strictly voluntary, no mandates here. However, if your local government would like to be eligible for PRO funding to expand services in the first program plan period, which will run from July 1st, 2025 through calendar year 2027, you will need to complete the survey. And DEQ is required to conduct a needs assessment survey periodically. So if your community is not interested this time around, it will not be your last chance to participate. There will be other needs assessments surveys down the road. So before we move on, I will pass it back to Hannah for another poll question.
Okay, so let's see. Going over to the Next slide. So given the information about the needs assessment and eligibility for those opportunities, we would like to ask when Eunomia sends the needs assessment survey out to local governments, which method of survey would you prefer, a digital or hard copy? Launching that poll now. Please note that we've noted a hard copy could be mailed or emailed to you and returned in a hard copy format, just to accommodate whatever needs are appropriate. So I'll just give it a couple more seconds as people continue to make a selection. Okay. It's looking like we have a mixed results of both digital and hard copy, and our understanding is that Eunomia does plan to offer it both ways, with the preference being digital copy, and we will make sure to share that expectation with them. Thank you for participating in that, and I will hand it back over to Justin.
Perfect. Thanks, Hannah. So here's a tentative timeline for engaging in the needs assessment survey. We are currently presenting about this opportunity to you folks right now. As noted earlier, in January, Eunomia will hold informational sessions about the needs assessment survey, and will begin to distribute the survey in January. The survey needs to be completed and is due back to DEQ in March of 2023, around mid-March. And looking ahead, DEQ's deadline for compiling and completing the assessment is July 1st, 2023. The DEQ will receive PRO program plans by the end of March 2024, and the program plans will include, among other things, details for how the PROs plan to fund the expansion of services expressed in the needs assessment. So we gave you a very quick high-level summary of everything associated with what we know is Section 13 of the RMA. But there's a lot going on with this act, and we want to make sure that everybody here is aware of all the opportunities to stay engaged with the implementation / rulemaking process associated with the RMA. The first is attending the rulemaking advisory committee meetings associated with the RMA. We are currently about the midpoint, past the midpoint of the first rulemaking period. We just had a meeting last week. And our next scheduled meeting is January 11th. And this first rulemaking period will wrap up in May. And as I noted, the second rulemaking period will begin around late summer 2023. All those meetings are open to the public. Anybody can attend, and all those meetings also provide a public comment period toward the end. So any comments that anybody wants to make, you would have that opportunity. We will also note that everybody has at least some representation at the table. So you can also go to the webpage dedicated to the rulemaking effort, and you can see the roster of folks that make up our rulemaking advisory committee, and that is your representation at the table, and your comments and feedback and such can also go through these individuals. Next is attending any of the technical work group meetings that we hold. We just wrapped up the technical work group associated with the materials list and the Uniform Statewide Collection List work, but we are getting ready to launch a technical work group for all the MRF related work around the contamination management fee, processor commodity risk fee, as well as the permit and certification standards. And that group should be holding its first meeting before the end of this year. And those meetings will go through the better portion of next year. And there could be a technical work group as well for the contamination reduction work that's going to come down the road. So like all our meetings associated with implementation of the RMA, those meetings too are public, and you can attend those and provide public comment at the tail end of those meetings. Next, it's also attending the Recycling Council meetings. The Recycling Council in the Act, it's known as the Oregon Recycling System Advisory Council, was established by the Act, and that council just met not too long ago. Those meetings too, open to the public. Like I noted, all other meetings, you can attend that, and you also have representation at that table, and you can provide any feedback or comments to folks at the Recycling Council as well. Lastly, I will note that Every project that we are undertaking with the RMA has a dedicated web page, whether it's rulemaking, MRF work, materials list work. There are dedicated web pages for these projects. And you can find all of that as well as section by section summaries, FAQs, amongst other resources associated with the RMA at recyclingact.oregon.gov. So everything there should get you up to speed on anything and everything you would want to know about the RMA. You can also sign up for Gov Delivery at the website, which would provide you updates on anything and everything associated with the RMA as we make our way through this process. So with that, I will turn it back over to Hannah for a quick stuff.
So we want to make it to take a moment to provide our regional specialist contact information to you. It is described by both the region and the county here on this slide. Your regional specialists are available to respond to your questions about recycling expansion opportunities that are relevant to your community, and they'll be able to assist you with filling out the needs assessment survey when that comes around in early 2023. As a note, we have posted these presentation slides on the recyclingact.oregon.gov webpage for your reference, and Gretchen was kind enough to share the link to that in the chat if you want to navigate there. And I'll give it back to Justin to wrap us up.
Perfect. So that's all we have this morning. We want to thank each of you for being here to learn about the RMA, specifically the local government compensation portion of the RMA, as well as the next steps associated with rulemaking and implementation of this law. So now it's your turn to ask any questions of us. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or use the raised hand feature. We will call on you one person at a time. So let's go ahead and start the discussion portion of this. Thank you, everyone.
At this point, I am stopping the recording. Thank you.